Barcelona, the city and the city. The city of Barcelona is the other most mythologized hero of the Spanish Civil War, and it has a similarly outrageous history. It was possessed of a double identity. One, the center of government, home to citizens of goodwill and lovers of order. The other, the center of rebellion, the dangerous other city. A center of resistance during the war, and also the site of the street battles between communists and anarchists during the May Days of 1937, Barcelona had a long and profound revolutionary tradition. As far back as 1854, workers marched under the banner Association or Death, demanding the right to form trade unions. In 1919, while Barcelona was experiencing a major strike in its repression, the newspaper union informed their publishers that they would not publish anything that might work against the strikers. When the government tried to draft the workers as a means of breaking the strike, the newspapers simply did not print the draft notices. In a city in which even the most fundamental means of messaging was controlled by revolutionary workers, the presence of law, order, government, and business was always contingent and troubled. Barcelona fits Manuel Castells' model of the wild city, uncontrollable, with visible social tensions and violence, dystopian, if only to the eyes of the elite. Alehem cites Ignacy Terrades in describing Spain as an absentee state in Barcelona, its center of government. Quote, an authority structurally incapable of ameliorating the social problems engendered by the urbanization, industrialization couplet through the provision of a social wage of collective educational, medical, and welfare services. Moral panics about the uncontrollable poor youth, Alehem says, stemmed from the boss's fears that future generations of workers would not accept their place in the industrial order. The church was expected to do something about this, but relied only on the older methods of violence and fear to manage the poor, especially among the children it educated. Shanty towns, barracas, were very common in Barcelona and were sites of social disorder. As the government became more sophisticated, it tried to replace them with projects, cases barates, in an early form of biopolitical management. These were not popular. For the most part, however, the state did not practice the kinds of soft control masquerading as social welfare to which we are now accustomed in poor areas. This fed revolutionary rather than reformist struggle. Quote, because the experience of the repressive state was undiluted by social welfare initiatives, most workers had little desire for a political campaign to conquer the state. Rather, the state was seen as a mortal enemy that had to be crushed. Barcelona figured prominently in the pre-war era of uprisings, insurrections, labor struggle, and atentado, and it developed a generally rebellious culture to go along with these. During the tragic week of 1909, a time of Catalonian insurrection against troop conscription, Barcelonan workers, murcianos, migrant workers, sex workers, and other déclassés threw up barricades and fought the police. Nor was this an exceptional situation. Barcelona's normative condition was of generalized proletarian illegality. This included theft and shoplifting, the, quote, small arms fire in the class war. This petty illegality was politicized. Quote, shopkeepers and shop workers regularly reported that those who seized groceries from shops justified their actions in terms of the recession, that they were unemployed and, through no fault of their own, lacked the economic resources to purchase victuals. Similarly, those who ate without paying in bars and restaurants justified their actions in terms of their right to life. Unsurprisingly, conflicts between the police and workers, the unemployed, and other marginalized people were common. This, too, was politicized. Quote, the struggle of the unemployed with the police was inseparable from popular traditions of resistance to authority. So great were these traditions that detainees frequently appealed to passers-by to intercede on their behalf. Crowds were often more than happy to oblige, attacking the police and attempting to free detainees whether they knew the arrested person or not. The police of Barcelona were particularly ineffective against collective female resistance to eviction. Families' belief that they had a right to live in their homes superseded petty issues like unpaid rent. State violence tended to deepen rather than suppress social rebellion. Quote, street practices sealed the working class from the state and its laws and from those entrusted with their enforcement. Anti-police feelings flowed ineluctably from the institutional role of the police as the regulators of social space. When imprisonment did occur, it was hardly less tolerated. Quote, Soon after the proclamation of the Republic, Centistas, CNT members, marched on the model jail to release their comrades. Prison records were also destroyed in a very orderly 2-hour operation. However, in a foreshadowing of repression to come, the Civil Guard prevented crowds from destroying the records of the political police, Brigada Policia Especializada en Anarquismo y Sindicalismo. The women's jail of Barcelona was liberated on the very first day of the anarchist defense of the city against Franco. People hung a red and black flag above it and posted a sign saying, "This torture house was closed by the people, July 1936. The jail was demolished within a month by the decision of Mujeres Libres. In light of all the struggle and anger, it is not surprising that Barcelona anarchists fought the Civil Guard, putatively their allies against Franco. During the May Days there in 1937, even George Orwell was able to make the connection. Quote, "Once I had heard how things stood, I felt easier in my mind. The issue was clear enough. On one side, the CNT, on the other side, the police. I have no particular love for the idealized worker as he appears in the bourgeois communist's mind, but when I see an actual flesh and blood worker in conflict with his natural enemy, the policeman, I do not have to ask myself which side I am on." Footnote. On the other hand, the Barcelona anarchist militia government established a police force of their own, with patrollers supplied by the CNT and judges by the FAI. Some mistakes do not need to be repeated. On the rare occasion that Barcelona anarchists were somehow not the group directly under attack, they formed a collaborative relationship of solidarity with those who were. Quote, "While the CNT had always recruited workers irrespective of their place of origin, and indeed continued to do so, the radicals channeled the hostility of migrant outsiders to the authorities, and militant Cenetistas and anarchists defined themselves as Mercian in solidarity with the community under attack. These migrant workers joined CNT protests not because they are alienated or isolated individuals, as was suggested by the authorities. Instead, their protest was firmly located within a supportive network of organized social relations that provided mobilization of resources and protection from external threats. While this contrasts with the experiences of some modern migrants who are systematically atomized and isolated by repeated forced dislocations, the rationale backing government repression of migrants was the same then as today. Quote, "By drawing on racist, social Darwinist, and colonialist discourse, migrants, and occasionally also indigenous workers, were presented as morally inadequate, living in a state of nature or primitive barbarism, the criminal heart of darkness in the city." Especially during the ERC era, when Catalonian nationalists were in the government, Murcians, largely African, were depicted as subhuman and illiterate by the press, responsible for all social problems, especially the impoverishment of Barcelona. The ERC also started issuing an unemployed workers card with one's work history. Anyone who did not carry it with them faced the workhouse or repatriation. We continue to be familiar with these attempts to monitor and control the movements of the poor, and to direct their animosity along racial lines rather than against their common foe. We, the poor, continue to defy them. The state knew it was necessary to destroy the streets of Barcelona, in which migrants and anarchists commingled every day, in order to control them. Plans were drawn up to kill the street by demolishing the Raval, an immigrant neighborhood and center of revolt, and building roads through historic and symbolic plazas, which would be, quote, "replaced with major roads, places without history, around which new solidarities would not be possible." In this way, the authorities would redefine space and the way it was used and experienced. This project continues today in many reforming urban spaces. However, Elham situates this moment in Barcelona historically as a product of European moral panics in reaction to the formation of the working class and modernization in general. The destruction of the streets was, quote, "part of a hegemonic project, an ideological offensive through which urban elites sought to strengthen the bourgeois public sphere by limiting working-class access to the streets. This was a language of power that allowed the urban bourgeoisie to define the streets as its own. They delineated the permissible uses of public space, castigating all resistance to the expansion of the capitalist urban order." The enemies of anarchists attempted to control the positive terms of the discussion, most chillingly in the motto of a violent bourgeois anti-red paramilitary group, the Sommetent militia. Peace, peace, forever peace. In contrast to the ever more repressive imaginary of reactionaries and state forces, people report a revolutionary spirit filling the streets of Barcelona during the early days of the war, a temporary opening, a taste of freedom. Clara Thalmann, a Swiss veteran of the Civil War, quote, "In Barcelona, the ethos was different from what it had been before. I had known the city back then. Previously, it had been impossible for a woman to venture out into the street alone. Now women could be seen sitting in the cafes, chatting, with their rifles across their knees. Women were, all unexpectedly, free. All of a sudden it came to you. They too are showing an interest in all sorts of things." Barcelona even looked anarchist, with hundreds of red and black flags, multi-story anarchist murals, CNT FAI signs and banners on every flat surface. This was a direct outgrowth of decades of anarchist struggle in the city, not all of which was traditionally conflictual. Around 75 Ateneus, social centers for anarchist cultural empowerment, existed in Barcelona between 1877 and 1914. All had libraries and organized social and leisure activities, like hiking. These Ateneus were the sole source of education in much of Barcelona, especially excluding the church, and were a formal point of contact between the CNT and the barris, which had a symbiotic relationship. Alehem, quote, "For the city's workers, the barris were a total social environment. They were spaces of contestation and hope, the starting place for resistance against the bourgeois city." This defies the false dichotomy between positive and negative action the state tried to enforce upon the revolutionaries of Barcelona. While attacks and robberies came out of those neighborhoods, they were not the work of a few bad apples. Rather, quote, "the expropriation squads were deeply rooted in the social formation and were virtually impossible for the police to infiltrate." Anarchists understood that when the state holds the power of verediction, the violence its agents commits is laudable, and the peaceful acts those it governs commit are crimes. Footnote. I am most familiar with the term verediction from the section of Foucault's Collège de France lecture series published as The Birth of Biopolitics. Most simply, it is the power to create truth, held by those who have the most power in any given encounter or ongoing dynamic. As it was put by the leader of the Builders Union, quote, "In a society that legalizes usury and has robbery as its basis, it is logical that there will be some who are prepared to risk their lives and achieve through their own audacity what others manage to do with the protection of coercive state forces." Just as rural anarchists saw the pueblo as the central structure of post-revolutionary society, so urban anarchists saw the barri. Sanatistas envisioned the transformation of the body into collectively run liberated zones that practiced direct democracy. They were not far from that already, expressing the anarchist value of the means of struggle mimicking the future in which one wishes to live. Collective reciprocity, what Raymond Williams calls the mutuality of the oppressed, was a fundamental structure of barri life. Also, it could be withdrawn from those who defied communal norms by committing acts of interpersonal violence like domestic abuse, stealing from one's comrades, or snitching. Even the impact of repression was softened by the barri, as it was widely dispersed, which also worked against the free rider problem. No one was able to benefit from struggle without contributing to it, and all lived under the risk from its consequences. Within the body, by Alehem's analysis, quote, "Consciousness formation was very complex, molecular, and dynamic, whereby individual and collective experiences of the social and spatial orders were accumulated and refined through a process of reflexive engagement. In this way, the practical, sensuous experiences of material realities and the everyday struggle to survive within a determinate space were converted by workers into a series of collective frames of reference. The result was that a communal reservoir of class-based experiential knowledge, a refraction of everyday urban practices, the product of the sharp learning curve of everyday oppression and exploitation. This generated a situated form of local consciousness, a social knowledge of power relations within a specific locale, a vision of the world embedded in a specific time and place, constructed on the ground from below. In its most elementary form, the sense of class was more emotional than political. It represented a powerful sense of local identity, an esprit de quartier stemming from the extensive bonds of affection generated by the supportive rituals, solidarities, and direct social relationships of neighborhood life. It was in essence a defensive culture, a radical celebration of the local group and the integrity of its lived environment predicated on the assumption that everyday life was constructed in favor of them to the detriment of us. When one attempts to clearly delineate the time in which a revolutionary spirit prevailed during the war, one is forced to box off small locations and time frames, few of them congruent with each other. The ways in which social relationships and identities changed during this period were, as Graham puts it, ultra-contingent, subjective, and fragile. Perhaps most important in this way were the land collectivization projects in village communes far away from urban centers like Barcelona. I am hesitant to describe them here. I think it is better to leave moments of true utopian opening shrouded so that they may not be captured. But, Dave tells us, quote, the shock of July 36 gave rise, on the margins of political power, to a social movement whose real expressions, while containing communist potential, were later reabsorbed by the state they allowed to remain intact. The first month of a revolution already ebbing, but whose extent still concealed its failure, looked like a splintering process. Each region, commune, enterprise, collective, and municipality escaped the central authority without actually attacking it, and set out to live differently. Even the ebb of 1937 did not eradicate the elan of hundreds of thousands of workers and peasants who took over land, factories, neighborhoods, villages, seizing property and socializing production with an autonomy and a solidarity in daily life that struck both observers and participants. Communism is also the reappropriation of the conditions of existence. This process was far more extensive and heartfelt than the land reforms attempted by the Republic in earlier years. As Dave notes later, quote, what distinguishes reform from revolution is not that revolution is violent, but that it links insurrection and communization. Footnote. Dave, an anti-state communist, is here using the term communization to mean the process of holding all things in common, rather than an envelopment by the Communist Party. Whether in the body or on the land project, the political emotion of the moment, as well as its material effect, is central. In his paper, The Revolutionary Spirit, Hannah Arendt and the Anarchists of the Spanish Civil War, Joel Olson agrees with Dave about the central importance of these projects. By his research, quote, there are up to 1,850 collectives covering 1/2 to 3/4 of the land in Republican Spain. Their governing structures, a melange of committees, assemblies, and councils, were self-organized and given real decision-making ability by their participants. Olson sees these structures as a preservation, even genesis, of the revolutionary spirit that Arendt regards with both hope and suspicion. In On Revolution, Arendt theorizes that the revolutionary spirit that moves people towards freedom is the same that soon forms the limit of freedom, creating totalitarian governments and repression. Olson contends that the example of these collectives, formed around the economic necessities of daily life, shows another possibility, that directly democratic governance is possible as a permanent way of life. There were limits to this. Formalized committee structure, inherited from the CNT, threatened many collectives with entrenched bureaucracy, but it was fascism that cut this grand experiment short. Until then, Olson says, quote, it could be said that those who participated in the revolution experienced what Arendt calls public happiness, the unique feeling that comes with engagement in the public realm. At the front, boring, interminable, and desperate, a certain myth of communization, bravery, and political evolution has nevertheless emerged, thanks, for American audiences at least, largely to Orwell and Hemingway. Footnote. As Hemingway has largely been described as acting like a useless coward by other participants, I have chosen not to quote any of his work around the Civil War. Orwell, quote, the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money-grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. The ordinary class division of society had disappeared to an extent that is almost unthinkable in the money-tainted air of England. There was no one there except the peasants and ourselves, and no one owned anyone else as his master. However much one cursed at the time, One realized afterward that one had been in contact with something strange and valuable. One had been in a community where hope was more normal than apathy or cynicism, where the word comrade stood for comradeship, and not, as in most countries, for humbug. One had breathed the air of equality. The Spanish militias, while they lasted, were a sort of microcosm of a classless society. In that community where no one was on the make, where there was a shortage of everything but no privilege and no bootlicking, one got, perhaps, a crude forecast of what the opening stages of socialism might be like. The effect was to make my desire to see socialism established much more actual than it had been before. Partly, perhaps, this was due to the good luck of being among Spaniards, who, with their innate decency and their ever-present anarchist tinge, would make even the opening stages of socialism tolerable if they had the chance. Productive conversations sometimes occurred between the two sides. An international volunteer remembers, quote, "I read this text on the loudspeaker in Italian saying, 'What are you doing? Why do you not just come over? Why are you fighting for Mussolini instead of fighting for Italy, which is on our side?' Something like that. And many of the Italian soldiers, after that, they come over to our side. And the Italian artillery begins to shoot above us, aiming over our head, and then we get the order to attack. With the Dombrowski on one side and the Thielmann on the other, we attack. And we totally put the Italian fascists to a rout. The Italian fascists, they keep surrendering, thousands of them. And I laugh. These are the people who are going to build a new Roman Empire." Serving with that same Thielmann battalion later played a role in challenging one international's perception of the confines of national identity as he later interrogated German prisoners in Canada. Quote, "I became very prejudiced against the Germans because so many of them denied knowledge of concentration camps. They are all anti-Semitic. I had a few jailed, put in isolation. And yet, I remember the Thielmann battalion, the best Germans, fantastic Germans, dedicated, honorable, beautiful people who sacrificed their lives so willingly for others, which had suffered the most casualties in Spain. The contradiction was hard for me." The assessments of Spanish anarchists offered by the foreign volunteers are almost universally positive. Said one, "The anarchists I knew were incredibly courageous. There was one in my outfit, an older man, an old wobbly. He was a marvelous human being. He would argue with anybody that was willing to argue with him, which I wasn't, but in his actions he was brave and wonderfully generous and very, very likable. And yet, despite all of these descriptions of laudable heroism, we must be careful to refuse glorifying the revolutionary dead. I doubt they would have wanted it, and if we are to remain true to their values or carry on their legacy of struggle, we must remember that these arguments behind the lines about politics, the sudden ability of women to relax in Barcelona cafes, the intense amounts of caring labor, shared joy, and endless meetings were no less vital to the revolutionary struggle than their attacks or engagement in traditional warfare. Indeed, it was a deficit in such exercises of freedom, silenced by internal repression and betrayal, that doomed the Spanish anarchists as much as their lack of ammunition. Women's struggle, at the front and behind the lines. Quote, "I told no one that I was going off to war. If I had, they would never have allowed me to go. The people I was living with would never have let me go without my father's permission. They would have done all in their power to stop me, and the same was true of the other women. The lorries pulled out a few minutes behind schedule, and some of the women would urge the driver, 'Come, shake a leg, otherwise my mother may show up and take me by the ears.'" Rosario Sanchez Mora, the Dinamitera. International female volunteers were sidelined to nursing or other care work. Spanish women, too, were largely pressured into doing war work rather than fighting, or sometimes actively organized themselves so, but a few determinedly escaped to the front, especially in the early days of the war. Women on the front worked incredibly hard to be treated with respect and quality by those around them. As for their special needs, they endured them in secret. Many of the accounts I read report suffering immensely from the need to keep menstruation a secret, and one woman described having a secret abortion on the front. She immediately went back to her duties, and no one knew, although she bled for 40 consecutive days. Mica Echeverri became a captain in the PUM. Women made their way to her unit, reasoning that there they stood the best chance of being treated seriously. One, Manolita, said to her, quote, "I am told that in your column the militia women have the same rights as the men, that they need not stick to the dishes or the laundry. I did not come to the front to give it the once-over with a cleaning rag in my hand. I've scoured enough dishes already." Echeverri's men admired her, but masculinized her to deal with the situation, proudly claiming, "We have a female captain with more balls than all the male captains in the world." She reflected wryly on this, quote, "What am I to them? Neither man nor woman, I suppose, a sort of special breed of hybrid. Their woman, an extraordinary woman, pure and strong, whose sex can be forgiven as long as she does not play on it." All of the other women whose accounts I read report being assigned a similar, not woman, exceptional status at the front. For some, this was actually advantageous on a personal as well as practical level. Fifi, for example, was a gender rebel from childhood who refused all traditional female roles and raged when her family tried to prohibit her from acting like a boy. This lifelong experience motivated her politics. She became a communist at 13 to, quote, "invest my struggle with some meaning. I wanted to take on something concrete, the source of all these injustices." When the war broke out, she, quote, "went home to pick up her things and say goodbye to her parents. Come on, give me a kiss, for I am off to the war." She never got the kisses. At war, she was free at last to fight her enemies openly and be treated equally by men, for the most part. Footnote. According to her interview with Strobel, she did once have to punch a superior officer from the regular army who accused her of sleeping with the men. All present backed her up, and she was not court-martialed. Later in life, the imprisoned Fifi, who fought so bravely before, during, and after the war, was monitored by the cell of the Communist Party within her prison for suspected lesbian tendencies and prohibited from spending too much time with any one woman. It is particularly tragic, if unsurprising, that she should be oppressed by the party on the very grounds by which she theorized her particular commitment to struggle, her gender defiance. Women's resistance is often undercounted because of the less obvious support roles women are socially coerced into filling. The women who worked in factories, fed fighters, did organizational work behind the lines, and later hid those who went underground were, it should go without saying, no less anti-fascist or valuable to that movement than those who fought on the front lines. Many more women worked behind the lines, whether in factories or in more revolutionary roles, than fought on the front. Quote, "The collectivization of life in anarchist Barcelona, for instance, was exclusively in the hands of the women." Mujeres Libres was a particularly active group of female anarchists. Their publications, in traditional anarcho-feminist fashion, attacked the institution of the family, gendered expectations for women, and the expectation that women will perform unpaid labor. While most communists deprioritized women's struggle until after the war had been won, an indefinite and, it turns out, permanent deferral, anarchists demanded liberation all at once. Unfortunately, Mujeres Libres was also responsible for political surveillance on behalf of control patrols in Barcelona, an incredibly distressing role for an anarchist group to play, and became embroiled in political infighting. Mujeres Antifascistas, a communist women's group, meanwhile focused on glorifying the importance of motherhood in producing and caring for the troops, a reactionary perspective on the role of women in struggle, one often shared by fascists. When Mujeres Antifascistas attempted to envelop Mujeres Libres in an umbrella women's Popular Front organization, the latter emphatically refused, able to see it as part of the general trend of communist enclosure and defanging of anarchist struggle. This internal strife was, of course, outmatched by the workings of the patriarchy. Lucia Sanchez Seornil, a founder and chief editor of the Mujeres Libres journal, quote, "There are many male comrades who honestly desire to see women collaborating in the struggle, but this wish is not matched by a fresh outlook on woman. Their comrades want her to collaborate so as to help encompass victory all that much more easily, at a strategic moment, so to speak, but without sparing a single moment's thought for the autonomy of women, and without for a moment ceasing to look upon themselves as the center of the universe. It is only possible to deprioritize these critiques if one is, or is allied with, their object, and to do so is actually counter-revolutionary as well as uncomradely. Rosario Sanchez Mora, La Dinamitera, on the whispers that women at the front were all prostitutes. Quote, "That's nonsense. On the front we were all militians, people of left-wing ideology and unbelievable ideals for which we were ready to die. I was 16 when I went to the front. I went there a virgin and returned a virgin. All this is just fascist propaganda designed to insult and blacken the women. In the trenches, the fascists used to call out to us, 'Cowards, do you have to bring your women folk along because, by yourselves, you just can't hack it?' The insecurities the fascists spoke to, the utilitarian nature of male support for women's liberation, and the call for women to deprioritize their own liberation all went hand in hand as a force of internal repression." The Internationals. Footnote. Unless otherwise noted, I only refer to the accounts of U.S. and Canadian international volunteers here, as published by Ch3. 40,000 to 60,000 internationals came to fight in Spain. Around 5,000 of these came from the U.S. and Canada. Only 2,300 of these 5,000 survived. Those coming from the U.S. were largely immigrants or children of immigrants, most of whom had a radical political orientation in their countries of origin. Footnote. One, John Paddy McElliot, serves as a particularly intense example. He saw his father murdered by the Irish Army for his participation in the IRA. McElliot promptly joined the IRA himself at the age of 13. After escaping from prison, where he had been put for violent IRA activity, he drifted around England, sucker-punching random Englishmen. Eventually, he ended up in Canada, from where he volunteered to go to Spain. They frequently came out of labor struggle. One participant said, after being arrested for labor organizing, quote, "I realized there was an us and there was a them in America as well as anywhere else. So when I heard, shortly after the big strike in Detroit, that the them and us were at it with guns in Spain, and what I thought would be the beginning of the final showdown, I decided to go." Another was even more explicit in his desire for conflict. Quote, "I remember telling the woman I was living with that it was finally a chance to be up against a cop on the picket line armed the way he was. You know, gun against gun." These volunteers were commonly politicized by the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, or by seeing or experiencing racist violence. Footnote. 150 black U.S. citizens were lynched between 1929 and 1933. The Scottsboro trial also occurred around this time, and communists were a large part of working for the eventually successful appeal. Many of those who went to fight in Spain were members of the Young Communist League, the only group openly organizing volunteers to go over, as the Palmer raids and resulting deportations had decimated the American anarchist movement by this time. Many volunteered simply because they were young, impulsive, and had nothing to lose. Said one, "I didn't really have political views, but I remember talking about what was happening in Spain and listening, and the next thing I knew, I wanted to volunteer. I told my mother, and she told me to go talk to my father, who was in the country hunting ducks. But I said, I do not have time, the boat is leaving, and that night I left." Some volunteers went on to have appropriately youthful adventures in Spain. One reports going on a one-day leave, running into Hemingway and getting drunk with him, and waking up with the realization that he had overstayed his leave. Desperate to get back to his column before anyone noticed his absence, he and another volunteer simply stole the U.S. ambassador's limousine and drove it to the front. For others, volunteering was a gesture of committing to fighting for a better world. Quote, "I think going to Spain was like going to the American South for politically conscious kids in the 1960s. For most, that gesture remained a worthwhile action. Quote, "We fought in Spain because it would benefit ordinary human beings everywhere. For all the errors, dogmas, harshness, petty or grand betrayals, the war in Spain was truly a war between right and wrong, between the exploited and the exploiters, between Democrats and fascists. And while there were some terrible leaders and some cowardly individuals on our side, by and by large it was certainly the most beautiful expression of the commitment to humanity by ordinary humans that I have ever read about or experienced." For many of these volunteers, internationalism was not only a closely held value, but a necessary outgrowth of their material experiences, citizenship, migration, and enfranchisement were beginning to be frequently contested things, especially for those with revolutionary politics. Jewish volunteers formed a quarter of the international brigades that fought for the Republicans. There was an entire Jewish company, the Botwin Company, formed within the Polish battalion but with international membership. It was named after a Jewish communist killed in Poland in 1934. Its flag bore the words, "For your freedom and ours," in Yiddish and Polish on one side and in Spanish on the other, and members of the Botwin Company would later fight in the French resistance. However, to paraphrase Albert Prego, a Jewish veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, their Jewish identity took a sideline to their internationalism, humanism, anti-fascism, and communism. Footnote. Quote, thus, while most of the volunteers who were Jewish may well have been non-religious and assimilationists and did not go to Spain, as Abraham Lincoln Brigade veteran Alva Bessie has said, quote, out of my Jewish nature or personality or unconscious, but to fight fascism, and specifically Nazi fascism, it is probable that being Jewish helped create that desire to fight Nazi fascism. After all, even the most anti-religious and assimilated Jew is made to feel Jewish by the anti-Semite. As Jean-Paul Sartre once said, the Jew is he who is defined as a Jew by his society. And if his society sponsors pogroms, all Jews will inevitably hate such attackers, even the Jews who only heard or read about the attacks from relative and distant safety. Repression may cause fear, even cowardice, but it also creates consciousness. Gerasi. Black Americans participated in the war on terms previously unavailable to them. Quote, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, in which around 90 African Americans fought, was the first non-segregated American military unit ever to exist, the United States Army itself continuing to operate segregation throughout the Second World War. One black nurse in the U.S. who served with the Republicans in Spain, Salaria Kia O'Reilly, went, of all reasons, because she was a Catholic. Quote, I always read about nuns working in poor places, taking care of the poor, and I always wanted to help the nuns as a nurse in this kind of work. I assumed that there would be nuns helping the poor in the Spanish Civil War, on the side of those who were defending democracy. Of course, she was disappointed in that expectation, although when she was captured by fascists and awaited execution, a nun smuggled her to freedom because of their shared faith. Later in life, she reflected that her experience in Republican Spain was the only time in her life when she was treated by respect and dignity by the white people around her. When she returned to the United States, she faced segregation in the army, decades-long harassment by the authorities, and even, late in life, persecution from the KKK for her interracial marriage and membership in an otherwise white church. For her, even the bullets of the fascists did not compare to living under white supremacy in the United States. When the Republic decreed that the international fighters must leave Spain, quote, women threw flowers and wept, and all the Spanish people thanked them. The internationals looked very dirty and weary and young, and many of them had no country to go back to. The German and Italian anti-fascists were already refugees. The Hungarians had no home either. Leaving Spain, for most of the European volunteers, was to go into exile. Three, collaboration, a fatal logic. Quote, when all this began, the state was a phantom to which no one paid attention. The War Committee of the Iron Column. Unfortunately, according to Graham, quote, the Spanish left had never developed an anti-colonialist discourse. Indeed, Republican attitudes to Franco's North African soldiers, whom they understandably feared, were scarcely less racist than those of the rebels themselves. This fear was based not only in the immediate situation, but on a long legacy of violent animosity. Bookchin quotes Brennan on the significance of Franco's pre-war deployment of Moroccan troops against the Asturias uprising. Quote, for 800 years, the crusade against the Moors has been the central theme of Spanish history. They still continue to be the hereditary enemy, the only enemy, in fact, against which the Spanish army had ever fought. This view of Moroccans proved a direct disadvantage to the Republic's tactics. According to Kern, quote, the CNT-FAI promised to abandon all Spanish territory in Morocco if Berber soldiers in General Franco's army could somehow be lured away, but no concrete action was ever taken. Footnote. From Kern 165, I have not seen this promise referred to elsewhere, and Graham implies that no such effort was made, merely talked about. Kern cites Pages in Working Class History, Spain and the World, August 26, 1938, page 3. Dauvet suggests why. Quote, the announcement of immediate and unconditional independence for Spanish Morocco would, at minimum, have stirred up trouble among the shock troops of reaction. The Republic obviously gave short shrift to this solution, under combined pressure from conservative milieus and from the democracies of England and France, which had little enthusiasm for the possible breakup of their own empires. From a tactical perspective, as well as the ethical, this is too bad. If Franco had been faced with revolt from his back, things might have been different. I don't know anything about Moroccan attitudes of the time, but I know that people generally resent being conscripted by their occupier, and several historians make the point that Franco's troop supply might have been diminished by some expression of solidarity from Spanish radicals. I think Spanish attitudes about the Moors played a major role in this failure, though Orwell agrees with Dauvet that the French would not have appreciated a liberated Spanish Morocco. So, quote, the best strategic opportunity of the war was flung away in the vain hope of placating French and British capitalism. That analysis rings true, as it proved to be a dominant theme of events to follow. The initial, small, very justifiable anarchist collaboration with the government, voting in the 1936 election in hopes of freeing their comrades, marked the beginning of a disastrous trajectory. One might well say that an unsuccessful revolutionary gesture that leaves thousands in prisons is a disastrous trajectory itself, and some have even describing the Asturias rebellion as counter-revolutionary. Footnote. This was the word used by a Traintista, one of the CNT dissenters from FAI radicalism. However, Asturias also caused the opposite effect. Following its suppression, according to Kern, quote, the socialists and communists were filled with the same kind of anger that had once motivated the CNT and the FAI. Other sections of the Spanish left began behaving as if they, too, were anarchists. There is nothing in the anarchist philosophy that marks imprisonment as a failure, after all. Collaboration with the government, on the other hand, is highly suspect, and anarchists, then and now, have argued about whether this move towards government involvement and working closely with statist communists, socialists, and republicans doomed the anarchist effort in Spain. Quote, even Buenaventura Durruti gave participation in the elections a lukewarm endorsement after the Popular Front promised to free all political prisoners. Quote, we face a situation which could quickly turn into a revolution or a civil war. The worker who votes and then quietly returns home will be a counter-revolutionary. So will be the worker who does not, but nonetheless refuses to fight. As Barcelona anarchists fought off the initial fascist assault, they met with the Catalan government to form a revolutionary committee that would participate in running the country. In a bizarre yet sensible twist, members of Nosotros, the militant FAI affinity group, became the informal committee running the militia. Some CNT FAI members became government employees. In November, 4 anarchist ministers were admitted to the national government, though this act ran contrary to the Republican desire to present an acceptable image to not only France and Britain, but even to the USSR. Anarchists were personas non grata everywhere. The CNT incorporation into the government also outraged many anarchists, especially those at the front. The Iron Column sent out a communique of grave condemnation. Quote, over the wire comes news that the CNT is going to join the government. Thus, it is embracing what it has always attacked, thereby destroying the basis of our ideas. From now on, there will be no more talk of liberty, but rather submission to our government. History moves on, the state survives, and all in the name of an organization that professes to be libertarian. For how much longer, comrades? Abel Paz looks back on the moment. Quote, having right on one side was not enough to stop the advance of the counter-revolution. One needed the determination to tear it up from the roots once and for all, and this was precisely what was not done. There was a desire for discussion, as if chatting with a friend who was defending the same interests. But this was not the case, because the component parts of the counter-revolutionary onslaught was cut from the same cloth as those beyond the front lines, whose ideology was plainly fascist. The revolution lacked the strength needed in order to arrive at its ultimate conclusion. And because of this deficiency, everything that happened during the month of November had a fatal logic, although it would take a lot of intense pain before the serious error that had been committed was finally understood. Some anarchists who joined the government pushed through at least incidentally helpful policies. Federica Montseny, who previously identified as a nihilist individualist anarchist, but was now serving as the Minister of Health, managed to decriminalize abortion, an epic feat anywhere in 1936, but particularly remarkable in traditional Catholic Spain. However, the American anarchist Emma Goldman, previously on friendly terms with her, came to distrust her over her time in Spain. In 1936, she wrote Rudolf Rocker, quote, "I have seen and talked to Federica Montseny. She is a Lenin in skirts. She is idolized here. She is capable and brilliant, but I am afraid she has something of the politician in her." In a letter to Rocker 6 months later, Goldman is harsher. "Only blind zealotry will deny that Montseny is the most willing to compromise. I hope you understand, dear Rudolph, that I have no personal reason to say that Federica has gone further to the right than any of the leading CNT FAI members. Not only that, but she is as dogmatic against any critical expression on the part of comrades in the FAI as anyone else." As she became aware of Montseny's role in trying to get anarchists to disarm in the midst of the 1937 May clashes in Barcelona, Goldman drove the final nail into her assessment. Quote, "I hold Federica Montseny, Garcia Olivar," Dirty's former comrade, and several others of the leading comrades responsible for the gains made by the communists and for the danger now threatening the Spanish Revolution and the CNT-FAI. My very first interview with these new comrades has shown me that they are on the borderline of reformism. I had never met Oliver before, but I had met Federica in 1929. The change, since the revolution swept her forward to the highest top-notch as leader, was only too apparent. I was strengthened in that impression every time I talked to her about the compromise she and the others had made. It was too obvious to me that these comrades are working into the hands of the Soviet government, that in showing their gratitude to Stalin and his regime, dire results were sure to follow. Incidentally, it also meant the betrayal of our comrades in the concentration camps and prisons of Russia. I never saw a greater breach of faith with anarchist principles than the joint love fest of the CNT-FAI with their Russian satraps in Barcelona. I have not written about this to anyone, dear comrade, though I felt indignation and could have cried out my contempt of the so-called leaders of the CNT-FAI. Montseny, for her part, proudly claimed her political compromise, saying, quote, "Although it had been our aim, to attempt a total conquest would have meant a broken front and consequently failure. The fact is that we anarchists were the first to modify our aspirations, the first to understand that the struggle against international fascism was in itself great enough." Goldman could not disagree enough with how Montseny viewed the ethical and tactical aspects of her decision to collaborate. In a letter she sent to Rocker a few days later, Goldman despairingly wrote, "You will see that the murderous Stalin gang have killed Bernini and another comrade, and that they were back of the attempt to disarm the comrades of the CNT-FAI. Still more terrible to me is that Oliver and Montseny have called a retreat and have denounced the militant anarchists to whom the revolution still means something as counter-revolutionists. In other words, it is a repetition of Russia with the identical method of Lenin against the anarchists and social revolutionaries who refuse to barter the revolution for the Brest-Litovsk peace." Goldman withheld these criticisms from the public to avoid undermining the war, which later caused her to be unfairly understood as a collaborationist with the collaborationists by other anarchists. In fact, she was among the best equipped to understand the mistake the Spanish anarchists were making, having previously written the text My Disillusionment in Russia in an attempt to explain to the international anarchist population that the Soviet Revolution had taken a dark turn. Unfortunately, the things she described were still not widely known outside the USSR for many years, and her warnings were not taken seriously by more than a few anarchists who had also experienced communist betrayal, such as, later, the survivors of the Spanish Civil War. In May 1937, the Republican government moved to suppress the anarchists in POUM which it labeled a Trotskyist organization. Footnote. As Orwell trenchantly observes, this implied that scores of thousands of working-class people, including 8,000 or 10,000 soldiers who were freezing in the front-line trenches, and hundreds of foreigners who had come to Spain to fight against fascism, often sacrificing their livelihood and their nationality to do so, were simply traitors in the pay of the enemy. Both Orwell and his comrades to the front were included in this accusation, though Orwell never actually joined the POUM, for which afterward, when the POUM was suppressed, I was rather sorry, he says, in a tender display of solidarity. The USSR viewed both anarchists and POUM as its enemies, and the Spanish government, primarily communist at this point, was bent on a path of permanent appeasement of this cantankerous ally. It therefore accused POUM of being not just Trotskyists, but fascist agents. And on April 25th, the Republicans seized control of an anarchist-held outpost, killing 4. People on both sides began caching weapons in preparation for greater conflict. Contrawise, all agreed to hold no events on May Day, a traditional day of anarchist, socialist, and communist demonstration, for fear of serious fighting breaking out. It did anyway a few days later in Barcelona, in the ironically termed May Days. George Orwell happened to be in Barcelona at the time, on holiday from the front, and wrote a vivid description of the fighting in which he participated, a sort of horrible, interminable standoff. Despite the fear-mongering government claims that anarchists had stockpiled massive quantities of weapons away from the front, it was the government police who were the better equipped for this battle. Somehow, their weapons had not all been sent up to the desperately under-provisioned front. Orwell says, quote, "The civil guard carboneros, who were not intended for the front at all, were better armed and far better clad than ourselves. I suspect it is the same in all wars, always the same contrast between the sleek police in the rear and the ragged soldiers in the front." This is for exactly the reason demonstrated by the May Days themselves. To police one's own population is of greater interest to those in power than to protect it. The head of the Socialist Party, the PSUC, or PSUC, is even reported to have said, before taking Zaragoza, a city under fascist control, "We have to take Barcelona." The police had their own tradition of fighting leftists and could hardly be expected to do other than to fulfill their role. Orwell notes, at several occasions later in the war, for example, at Santander, the local civil guards went over to the fascists in a body. A column marching on Teruel that was composed of 1/4 militians and 3/4 civil guards was also betrayed to the fascists by the police within their own militia. They went to sleep as comrades, but the workers awoke to guns pointed in their faces. By Orwell's analysis, the workers who fought the Republican police in the May Days were right to do so. Quote, "A year after the outbreak of war, the Catalan workers had lost much of their power, but their position was still comparatively favorable. It might have been much less so if they had made it clear that they would lie down under no matter what provocation. There are occasions when it pays better to fight and be beaten than not to fight at all." And, in fact, the attacks of the government during that time affected the urban poor as a whole, not simply those shooting back. By disassembling the C&T food supply committees and reintroducing the free market, they effectively starved anyone short on money as inflation skyrocketed. Orwell's book, though it covers all of his experiences in Spain, from his time at the front to escaping further Republican repression, is centered around the betrayal of the anarchists and POUM by the communist government. Orwell, himself a socialist, was shocked, disgusted, and horrified by the May Days, the events that followed them, and what he came to understand their motives to have been. He developed a lifelong hatred of communists. Footnote. This hatred, common among Spanish Civil War vets, metastasized in Orwell. Years later, he gave information on British citizens he suspected of being communists to the British government. Though he did not do this with the purpose of calling repression down on them, it was a wholly irresponsible act in that era of red baiting. See various essays on Orwell's list. Homage to Catalonia, written only 5 months after Orwell left Spain, was a desperate attempt at producing embattled mythology in the face of near-certain defeat. Orwell was attempting to tell the truth he had seen as an act of solidarity, in a way that might be materially beneficial for the comrades he left behind. Unfortunately for him, the book sold only 1,500 copies during the first, most relevant years. People were not interested in hearing his critique. The May Days were very nearly the end. On June 15th, the POUM was declared illegal. Its leadership was jailed, followed by thousands more in short order. Orwell, who faced possible imprisonment or death for his service in POUM, even though he was a wounded international vet, escaped with his wife across the border. Many were not so lucky. Just before he left, he went to visit a friend from the front who had been thrown in jail. Even there, in a moment I find heartbreaking, he saw Vive la Revolution painted on the cell wall. Militarization was another step in the destruction of the revolution, though it was justified by the government as a way to, quote, free anarchist energies for the war in Aragon. Perhaps it is most useful to think through militarization, the process by which militias were regularized into army units and the most radical elements sieved out, via the perspective of those who had been incarcerated by the Republic but had been fighting alongside it since nonetheless. The Iron Column was one of the most famous of anarchist militias. As their opening move on the way to the front, they liberated the San Miguel de los Reyes prison and incorporated a large number of the freed prisoners into their ranks, as many as wished to join. A participant describes the action, quote, the opening of the gates and the releasing of all the inmates was the doing of a small group of comrades. They arrived at the prison and demanded that the gates be thrown open. There was no resistance, so they set everybody free. Most of the inmates were in San Miguel de los Reyes for criminal offenses, but there is also the odd comrade convicted for bank robbery or something like that. The opening up of the prison was prompted by principle and nothing more. It was an attempt to do away with something we regarded as a product of bourgeois rule. The inmates were victims of society and they had to be given a chance, at which point most of them joined the Iron Column, fighting and conducting themselves in an extraordinarily brave and intrepid fashion. Footnote: the essay Testimony of an Uncontrollable in the Iron Column, reprinted by Paz and reprinted by others as A Day Mournful and Overcast, is a poetic first-hand account by one of those liberated from prison who joined the column. Although I do not quote it here, it is well worth reading. This prison liberation is a rather beautiful example of how the revolutionary spirit of the militias both acted beyond the necessities of war and, incidentally, supported them in conducting that war. In contrast to the column's view and treatment of these prisoners, the police in the town in which the column massed who did not want to join the column was disarmed and left under close supervision. The column had learned from its lesson in Teruel that police do not transform easily into revolutionaries, unlike criminals. The government announced that the Iron Column would be militarized on April 1st. At its General Assembly in mid-March, the Iron Column debated whether it would comply. Paz quotes this debate at length, and it is certainly worth reading in its entirety. I will quote a few highlights. Quote, we cannot isolate ourselves by dealing only with the war. We must also spare a thought for the revolution. They want to blind us with cries of everything for Madrid, everything for the children. There are two capitalisms that intend to crush the revolutionary moment. A domestic capitalism, represented by the power of the Generalitat, and a foreign capitalism represented by England, America, and France. I will speak not as an anti-fascist, but as an anarchist. I oppose all authority, especially military authority. I am not a miliciano, but I have been to Russia, where I experienced the revolution and was able to observe the ways in which the anarchists were liquidated. At this point, the comrade summarized the Makhnovist movement. What counts is to maintain the spirit of anarchism and, equally, to try to find the resources that will give us strength. Even these few excerpts demonstrate the depth of political understanding, the tactical orientation, and the knowledge of those participating on the front lines of the war. The concerns voiced by Goldman, Orwell, and many other famous outsiders were not limited to that privileged few, but were generally understood. Despite this, the bulk of anarchists at the assembly agreed that greater discipline and reorganization was needed. By the end of the assembly, the column consented to militarization. Earlier, Durruti spoke on the issue of militarization in a speech he delivered just 2 weeks before his death, on November 4th of 1936. Quote, the militarization of the militias has been decreed. If this has been done to frighten us, to impose on us an iron discipline, this is a mistaken policy. We challenge those who have issued this decree to come to the front and see for themselves our morale and our discipline, and compare it with the morale and the discipline in the rear. We will not accept dictated discipline. We are doing our duty. Come to the front to see our organization. Later we shall come to Barcelona to examine your discipline, your organization, and your control. Orwell had a similar assessment of the militias. Quote, the essential point of the system was social equality between officers and men. Everyone from general to private drew the same pay, ate the same food, wore the same clothes, and mingled on terms of complete equality. If you wanted to slap the general commanding the division on the back and ask him for a cigarette, you could do so, and no one thought it curious. Later it became the fashion to decry the militias, and therefore to pretend that the faults which were due to lack of training and weapons were the result of the equalitarian system. Actually, a newly raised draft of militia was an undisciplined mob, not because officers called the privates comrade, but because raw troops are always an undisciplined mob. In practice, the democratic revolutionary type of discipline is more reliable than might be expected. In a workers' army, discipline is theoretically voluntary. It is based on class loyalty, whereas the discipline of a bourgeois conscript army is based ultimately on fear. When a man refused to obey an order, you did not immediately get him punished. You first appealed to him in the name of comradeship. Cynical people with no experience of handling men will say instantly that this would never work, but as a matter of fact it does work in the long run. Militarization included a decree prohibiting women from serving in the front lines. Quote, female militia members were fetched from the trenches, many of them weeping with anger as they were forced to board the buses that would carry them back into the rear guard. But, Strobel tells us, anarchist units somewhat ignored the ban. Paz gives us closer insight into this particular with an excerpt from the minutes of the Iron Column Assembly on militarization. Quote, Falomir asks that women not be admitted to the newly organized column on the grounds that they are a source of disturbance and only there to look for a man. After unanimous objection from the Assembly, these remarks are retracted. Comrade Pellissier clears up the situation of the female comrades by saying that any woman who wants to can come along as a miliciana as long as she brings her rifle. The true meaning of this dismissive response is highlighted by a personal account. Quote, I was present at the assembly that was eventually held, at which militarization was agreed to. I saw opposition come from many comrades, even from some female comrades who had earlier, according to some comrades, shown such bravery by leading the way into battle. I saw women who wept from anger and fury upon being told that they would no longer be able to continue fighting with their brigades, nor on any other front. Women fighters understood that they had lost their personal battle, that provisional tolerance was not the same as support. Dave. From the battle for Madrid in March 37 to the final fall of Catalonia in February 39, the cadaver of the aborted revolution decomposed on the battlefield. One can speak of war in Spain, not of revolution. Only a few more betrayals and bad decisions remained before the end. Negrin withdrew the internationals from the front in 1938 to prove that the Spanish military was not controlled by Soviet communists, in hopes of persuading the Allies to aid Spain. After the departure of their comrades from abroad, there was no hope for the remaining revolutionaries, nor for their betrayers. Franco formally defeated the Republic on April 1st, 1939. One could trace the path from anarchist voting, recognition of the government, however cynically motivated, to the collaboration between the anarchist militias and the government in the war, from that to the dissolution of the militias and militarization, to the depiction of POUM as a force of fascist provocateurs, and the suppression of the anarchists in POUM and the Barcelona May Days, to the following imprisonment of countless anarchists and other leftists who did not meet with the approval of the USSR, who had by then become the government's only hope, to the mass incarceration, torture, and persecution of any suspected of disloyalty under Franco. I have no desire, however, to locate an original sin for the Spanish anarchists, or indeed to blame these brave people at all for the way in which they were betrayed. Perhaps it would have been a betrayal of common sense, if more politically pure, to refuse to vote in a government that might release your comrades. In supporting the state, recognizing its authority in your life is far larger and more diffuse than voting or holding office. Dave, quote, no less than Marxism, anarchism fetishizes the state and imagines it as being incarnated in a place. The CNT declared the Spanish state to be a phantom relative to the tangible reality of the social organizations, i.e., militias, unions. But the existence of the state, its raison d'etre, is to paper over the shortcomings of civil society by a system of relations, of links, of a concentration of forces, as an administrative, police, judicial, and military network which goes on hold as a backup in times of crisis, awaiting the moment when a police investigator can go sniffing in the files of the social worker. The revolution has no Bastille, police station, or governor's mansion to take. Its task is to render harmless or destroy everything from which such places draw their substances. In this perceptive and important essay, When Insurrections Die, Dauvet argues that the basic problem of anti-fascism is that it forces the revolutionary to fight for the capitalist state against a projected worse version of the same capitalist state. Quote, as fascism is capital in its most reactionary forms, such a vision means trying to promote capital in its most modern, non-feudal, non-militarist, non-racist, non-repressive, non-reactionary forms, i.e. a more liberal capitalism, in other words, a more capitalist capitalism. From this perspective, the Spanish anarchists had almost failed from the moment they began fighting Franco instead of the Republic. Quote, as an undeniable class war was transformed into a capitalist civil war. We won't invite ridicule by accusing the left and far left of having discarded a communist perspective, which they knew in reality only when opposing it. It is all too obvious that anti-fascism renounces revolution. But anti-fascism fails exactly where its realism claims to be effective, in preventing a possible dictatorial mutation of society. Fascism is the adulation of the statist monster, while anti-fascism is its more subtle apology. The fight for a democratic state is inevitably a fight to consolidate the state, and far from crippling totalitarianism, such a fight increases totalitarianism's stranglehold on society. Footnote. I read this essay as it was reprinted in Endnotes Volume 1, where it serves as the basis for debate between Dauvet and Thierry Communiste about the relative importance of interrogating past history in terms of what could have been done differently. In contrast to a historically determinist reading, what was done is what was necessarily done because of material and theoretical constraints. Without seriously taking up that argument, I will say that my sympathies on this matter lie with Dauvet. Dauvet approvingly cites the ways in which the Durruti column paused to encourage collectivization of land and people's tribunals on their way to the front. When the radicals traded some of their autonomy for government support, he says, they believed they would be able to control the situation by virtue of being armed, but, quote, this was a fatal error. The question is not who has the guns, but rather, what do the people with guns do? 10,000 or 100,000 proletarians armed to the teeth are nothing if they place their trust in anything besides their own power to change the world. Otherwise, the next day, the next month, or the next year, the power whose authority they recognize will take away the guns which they failed to use against it. The power of the proletariat is not strictly one of firepower either. Quote, the question is not whether the proles finally decide to break into the armories, but whether they unleash what they are, commodified beings who no longer can and who no longer want to exist as commodities, and whose revolt explodes capitalist logic. Barricades and machine guns flow from this weapon. The greater the change in social life, the less guns will be needed, and the less casualties there will be. A communist revolution will never resemble a slaughter, not from any nonviolent principle, but because revolution subverts more, soldiers included, than it actually destroys. Helen Graham argues that, from the perspective of the socialists running the Republic, both the May Days in Barcelona 1937 and the socialist Largo Caballero's fall from Republican power must be seen as, quote, the liquidations of the vestiges of revolutionary power by the political representatives of the central state. Largo had performed a crucial task in the supremely difficult initial phase of the war. He had salvaged the structure of the bourgeois republic, and it was this, significantly strengthened, which swept him away. Similarly, the Munich Pact of 1938, in which the major powers of Europe allowed Hitler to annex parts of Czechoslovakia, marked a point, she argues, in which, quote, not only Czechoslovakia but the Spanish Republic was sacrificed on the altar of appeasement. As revolutionary elements within Spain were sacrificed to please the USSR, so revolutionary Spain itself was abandoned by the USSR in hopes of placating Hitler. The betrayer was betrayed. The final moments of the Republic, ended by one last military coup, signifies to Graham, quote, the convergence of diametrically opposed political and social interests against a communist party which, while it had alienated anarchists and some socialists by its protagonism in the destruction of popular revolution and the interests of Popular Front, had equally alienated its middle-class power base by failing to deliver the military victory on which the political commitment of the bourgeoisie had ultimately always depended. Some, like George Orwell, have argued that letting go of revolutionary goals undermined not just anarchist struggle, but the war effort in general, pointing out that a call to the international working class to join Spain in rising up against capitalism, the state, and a particular form of it called fascism might have generated a far more enthusiastic and widespread response than the prevailing idea of setting aside revolutionary goals in favor of prioritizing the war against the fascists. Footnote. Orwell, quote, "Once the war had been narrowed down to a war for democracy, it became impossible to make any large-scale appeal for working-class aid abroad. If we face facts, we must admit that the working class of the world has regarded the Spanish War with detachment. Tens of thousands of individuals came to fight, but the tens of millions behind them remained apathetic. For years past, the communists themselves have been teaching the militant workers in all countries that democracy was a polite name for capitalism. To say first, democracy is a swindle, and then fight for democracy is not good tactics. If, with the huge prestige of Soviet Russia behind them, they had appealed to the workers of the world in the name not of democratic Spain, but of revolutionary Spain, it is hard to believe they would not have got a response. However, this may also have been unsuccessful. The international brigades were organized primarily by communists. The socialists and anarchists of Europe and the US had largely opposed participation in World War I, and for some, this anti-militarism had turned into a sort of undefined pacifism, which inclined them against participating in the Spanish struggle. Others who might have come had already been decimated by repression. Although things would certainly have been different with a wider outreach effort, especially one that framed the struggle in terms of solidarity along class lines, the inertia of much of the international left may have prevented the outcome Orwell envisions. In a best-case scenario, if no anarchist had ever worked with the Spanish government, if more workers had come from around the world, if Franco had been defeated, could a revolution have been sustained in Spain? This is doubtful, partly for reasons of internal unreadiness, but more largely because of international issues. The United States, England, and France were all afraid of the USSR and of the implications of its communist revolution. They feared similar uprisings within their own borders, and they emphatically did not want a revolutionary Spain, no matter what its exact political alignment. The revolution was as possibly doomed as the anarchists who fought for it were, from all sides. I find their struggle of no less value for its tragic denouement. Consequences. Quote, "We are not in the least afraid of ruins. We are going to inherit the earth. There is not the slightest doubt about it. The bourgeoisie might blast and ruin its own world before it leaves the stage of history. We carry a new world here in our hearts. That world is growing this minute." Buenaventura Durruti. The Spanish Civil War was a testing ground for World War II. As Hochschild observed, many of the German weapons deployed in the war were first used in Spain by Franco's Nazi allies. And, Graham tells us, Spanish resistance to fascism, the putting down of which partially occupied Hitler and Mussolini and prevented Franco from possible participation in other conflicts or acts of imperialism, gave England time to rearm, to prepare for World War II. Had the people of Spain not risen up against fascism in such numbers and with such vigor, the oncoming World War might have had a different outcome. Without the radicalizing struggle of anarchists and other leftists for the preceding 60 years in Spain, there would not have been such resistance, as there is not in other countries in which fascism reared its head. People fight fascism to the extent to which they understand their own lives and freedom to be threatened by it. In the case of its immediate victims, the need for struggle is clear, which in no way diminishes the valor of their resistance. For those whose politics tell them that a threat to the freedom of any is a threat to the freedom of all, fighting fascism and its allies is a permanent necessity. For the survivors of the war, this necessity brought a huge amount of suffering. Thousands of adults were also incarcerated, often tortured. About 10,000 were interned in Nazi concentration camps, most in Mauthausen, where they bore the red triangle of active anti-fascist resistors. Footnote. Poetically, Hitler called his program against these Nacht und Nebel, usually translated as under cover of night, but literally night and fog, into which the anti-fascists had disappeared. It is a Wagner reference. Many who had endured this dread fate nevertheless entered the underground resistance upon their release or escape. Footnote. Strobel. Quote, in most instances, those of the Republican women fighters who were taken prisoner by the enemy during battle were brutally raped and then murdered. Some of them were lucky and were hauled off to prison. Those who were even luckier regained their freedom after 6, 7, or 10 years, after which it was not unusual for them to carry on with their work underground and perhaps to endure further arrests. One woman Strobel interviewed, Julia Chico Manzanal, fought on the front, returned home and was imprisoned. Her child died in prison with her. Her boyfriend died in prison, and she herself became temporarily paralyzed from prison conditions. She still, unbelievably, entered the underground resistance after her release. Even this depth of suffering could not cage her bravery. Perhaps, instead, it made any other form of life seem impossible. As well as from within Spain, some fought from exile in the USSR or from within northern Africa. Many fought with the fascinating MOI and the Maquis in France. A Spanish Republic unit was even given the dangerous honor of vanguard position in the liberation of Paris, but still did not receive the Allied support which they earnestly hoped would help them retake their country. A few returning Spanish Civil War vets who enlisted in the U.S. Army were sent behind enemy lines to do dangerous sabotage, quote, the only kind of active service for which the American government did not actively discriminate against those of its citizens who had fought for the Spanish Republic, Graham notes with pain. Within Spain, a dense atmosphere of enforced denunciation and fearful silence descended, and is only now, many years after Franco's death, beginning to fully lift. Graham describes the penal universe Franco imposed, both upon the hundreds of thousands he formally incarcerated and those who lived in the permanent state of exception outside of prison walls. 50,000 Republican children were taken from their families and institutionalized or placed with fascist families. By virtue of being defeated, the Republic had been found guilty, and Republicans were punished for that crime every day. Franco's victory itself was his legitimacy and virtue, and he asserted it daily through projects of sovereign veridiction like the Causa General, a fact-finding tribunal about war crimes. In a horrible, intensified echo of the role for which anarchists executed them, Catholic priests monitored and denounced their congregations. The war itself was referred to by the regime only as the Crusade, or War of National Liberation. And, as Spain slowly democratized in the 70s and 80s, a pact of silence remained. No one from the fascist side was ever brought to task for their crimes in the Civil War. Spain was excluded from the Marshall Plan of post-World War II reconstruction, thus guaranteeing its poverty for a time. Footnote. Graham, quote, it was the labor mobility generated in the 1950s, when Spain's economy had been kickstarted by trade and aid agreements with the USA, effectively Spain's very own Marshall Plan, that provided a way out from the rigid hierarchies and unforgiving memories of villages and provincial towns for red/defeated constituencies, most frequently in the shape of their sons and daughters. They headed as migrants to the growing cities to become the new workforce of a burgeoning industrial sector. The exodus of the poor from the rural South during these years finally solved the structural problem of mass landlessness that had been at the heart of Spain's social conflict in the 1930s, when the Republic attempted to address it in a more explicitly egalitarian manner. This is bitter. The United States did nothing to censure this totalitarian government, preferring to keep Franco as an ally against communist governments. Indeed, the United States employed lighter shades of the same tactics at home. A vast majority of American volunteers in the war faced decades of FBI and HUAC harassment upon their return to the States. Despite losing jobs and housing because of this harassment, almost none of these volunteers cooperated with the government against their former comrades. Footnote. By way of comparison, quote, during the McCarthy period, 60% of those accused of being communists or fellow travelers in Hollywood immediately cooperated with the government. In the labor world, 40% of fingered Unionists turned against their comrades. But of the 2,300 U.S. and Canadian survivors of the Spanish Civil War, all of whom were accused of disloyalty, and over 2,000 of whom were harassed by the FBI or Royal Mounted Police, exactly and only 11 cooperated with their witch hunters. Gerasi. Having faced the guns of the fascists abroad, down-home repression was no match for the valor and commitment of these veterans. Many left the Communist Party out of disgust with the USSR, especially after the 1956 revelations about the murderous exploits of Stalinism, but few left in acquiescence to repression. Quite a few jumped right back into labor organizing. One began the publishing house that published Negroes with Guns, Robert F. Williams' famous memoir of struggle, and another provided the headquarters space for the SDS when it began. The impact of the experience resonated for these participants for the rest of their lives. Evelyn Hutchins, the only female international who managed to get a role close to combat as a driver, held on to her animosities for years. She recalls how certain undercover fascist doctors were caught doing sabotage behind Republican lines, including unnecessary amputations. Quote, "There was a Spaniard who got away with it, just disappeared at that point. When I spotted him and he spotted me in New York, long after the Spanish Civil War, he just started running, and I lost him." Said another veteran, "Somebody had showed me a document which revealed that all the bombs that had been used by the fascists against us were manufactured in the United States by DuPont, and that the tanks that rolled over our bodies did so on Texaco fuel. So I came back to the United States exhilarated by my experience in Spain, by what I understood camaraderie and deep commitment meant on the one hand, and bitter, frustrated, and angry at my government on the other. To this day, I'm proud of the fact that I was, as I have been known, a premature anti-fascist." For all the sections of this text, as well as posters and other additional material, please see unquietdead.tumblr.com.
Thanks for listening to this reading of The Unquiet Dead. And for the following chapters, go to resonanceaudiodistro.org. Also, check out this trailer for one of our sister projects through the Channel Zero network.